the Iranians want the blockade lifted and they want to be able to sell oil. And I heard that just today the blockade was, Trump announced reinstating it. But the Iranians want relief. Yes. They don't want to get bombed. But if everything is too quiet in the Strait of Hormuz, they run the risk of what currently their worst nightmare is Trump does well in the midterms. And they want to scuttle it. So they want enough escalation that things are not going well for Trump, but not too much escalation. So both sides are kind of managing this escalation. And so it's not exactly a stalemate, but it's this very delicate dance that they're doing.
Welcome to this episode of Shoulder to Shoulder, a podcast where a pastor and a rabbi get to the heart of issues that matter to people of faith. I'm Pastor Doug Reed, here with my friend, Rabbi Pesach Wolicki. And on this episode, we'll be having a conversation with our good friend, who's no stranger to this podcast, Elliot Chodoff of the podcast Conflict Uncovered. You have to go and check it out. Before we jump into our conversation, please like our Facebook page and join our Facebook group, the Shoulder to Shoulder community, where you can interact with Pesach and me all week long. The best way to support this podcast is to go on over to Patreon, subscribe to Shoulder. For just $10 a month, you're helping us bring this message of Shoulder to more and more people all around the world. As a thank you for your $10 subscription, you get exclusive access to chapter-by-chapter Bible study, beginning in Genesis chapter 1 from Rabbi Pesach and myself. So go on over to Patreon, subscribe to Shoulder for just $10 a month. We're grateful for our sponsor, Israel 365 News, which is the place for you to go and get your news and information before going to anyone else. Go on over to Israel365news.com to check out some of their articles. Be sure to read Rabbi Pesach and my columns and enjoy all they have to offer. Pesach, each and every week, we promote wonderful products and initiatives that Israel 365 has going on. What are we supporting this week?
Today, we are encouraging everyone to sign up for a webinar that we are having this coming Monday, July 20th, a live webinar, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. in Israel. But don't worry if you can't make that time. If you register for the webinar, you will receive an email with the full webinar that you can watch on your own time, but you'll only get that email if you're registered for it. So even if you can't make it, make sure that you register. And here is the lineup. We are going to be talking about everything going on with Iran in the Middle East. And we have Brigadier General Amir Avivi, founder of the Israel Defense and Security Forum, one of the top military minds in Israel. And we have Brian Kennedy, president of the American Strategy Group, former president of the Claremont Institute, one of the most influential public intellectuals in American conservative political life. Dr. David Wormser, who is very familiar to this audience, senior analyst for Middle East Affairs at the Center for Security Policy, former advisor in multiple White Houses, and former member of the National Security Council. And rounding out the lineup, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and former IDF spokesman. An absolute all-star lineup talking about what's happening next in the Middle East that is taking place next Monday, this coming Monday, I should say, 1 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. in Israel live. But if you register, you get the podcast, you get the whole webinar anyway. And the way to register is you could either go to Israel365action.com, and on the front page there should be a link to register, or you could click the link in the description of this video if you're watching on YouTube. That is Israel365.com/regime. I think we'll give it to our producer, Scott, and he can put it in the audio links as well for this episode. And just, that's Israel365.com/regime, as in regime change. And you could register for this webinar. It's going to be an amazing, amazing program.
That sounds incredible. Excited to hear and be a part of that. It's going to be great. So register and get on that webinar. Well, Pesach, there's lots happening in the world. There's lots going on. President Trump has said ceasefire is over. He decided that he was only going to take one ride in his new Qatari airplane. And there are several other things that were not just surprising, but I guess some of it was a little anticipated and some of it was a bit of a surprise. But it seems that President Trump is now re-engaged with Iran. At least the bombs are starting to fall. And we got lots to talk about with our guest today. No guest of the show, our friend Elliot Chodoff.
Yeah, I don't think we should even bother having any conversation about these things before we bring Elliot in. I mean, I don't know if we're going to agree on everything because we haven't talked to Elliot in a while. But Elliot Chodoff is no stranger to this podcast. He is the host of Conflict Uncovered. I should say retired or reserved, not retired, reserve Major Elliot Chodoff. He's not retired at all. In fact, he's very, very busy. He has served in a whole host of different roles in Israel's security, different roles as in the military. And he was also a lecturer at Haifa University for many years. He's one of the experts on military strategy and the Middle East. And there's so much more we could say about our dear friend. It's been too long, Elliot. Welcome back to the Shoulder to Shoulder podcast.
Absolutely. Great to be back.
So, Elliot, let me tee this up. Let me tee this up with my thoughts, because you and I haven't spoken in a while. And I've been watching President Trump, and back when the memorandum of understanding was signed a few weeks ago, there was all this consternation on the Israeli side. Oh my gosh, he's flipped, he's turned. What's he doing? This flies in the face of everything he'd been talking about since the beginning of the war. How can this be? And you read the 14 points, and when it first came out, we were all in shock. It looked like a wish list for the Iranians. And the way things are turning out and the way Trump is talking, I'm starting to suspect that he looked at the faction in his team who wanted to negotiate, Witkoff, Kushner, Vance, and said to them, hey, you guys want to make a deal? Make a deal. I don't think it's going to last. I don't think it's going to work. Promise them $300 billion reconstruction fund, lifting sanctions. Go for it. I don't think they're going to do it. And they went ahead and made the deal, and sure enough, it fell apart. A dangerous game of chicken, perhaps, but I'm starting to think that Trump didn't have an about face at all, that he's allowing the different factions in his camp to let their policy play out. Shortly after the MOU was signed, Rubio was off to the Gulf states to do damage control. So I'm not sure Trump is fickle. I think he might just be allowing the different factions around him to play out their policy and see which one is successful. What do you think?
First of all, I don't think he's fickle. I think he's, first of all, under crossed pressure from a number of different directions. And you mentioned the faction within his camp who are more, let's say, negotiation-oriented, Witkoff, Kushner, Vance, and perhaps a few others. He has the midterms to concern himself with. Frankly, he did a very poor job of preparing and explaining to the American people why this erupted at the end of February. You can say he didn't do it in advance for surprise reasons, but he didn't do it afterwards either. And that left him sort of behind the eight ball in public relations. And I think he's now trying to play catch up on that. So I think there are a lot of reasons, and I'm sure there are a bunch that I haven't mentioned that have nothing to do directly with the actual situation in the Gulf and with Iran and in the Middle East. In other words, they're related too, but they're not the core. But he has to take them into account. I think that he is also, by instinct, trying to do something that any Western leader would try to do. The only question is under what circumstances. And that is to say, you know what? Diplomacy is better than war. If I can gain my objectives through diplomacy. Now, I'll give you two interesting strategic quotes on it. One by the renowned German strategist Karl von Clausewitz, who many people have heard of, who wrote a book on war, unreadable in any language. But I've taught it for about 30 years. And in it he wrote, and again, there are a number of famous quotes in the book, that war is an extension of policy by additional means. In other words, policy should be, now he's writing the way it should be, not the way it necessarily is, but war should be something that is done to promote an existing policy by, and this is key, very often misquoted, by additional means, not by other means. Policy doesn't end because war begins. War becomes another layer of it. Now, it could become the primary layer, That's number one. But that's 19th century Clausewitz. But let's go back 2,500 years ago to a Chinese strategist named Sun Tzu, who wrote a book called The Art of War. And in it, he wrote the best victory, is that of the battle you don't have to fight. In other words, if you can convince your adversary to acquiesce, to give you what your objectives are without fighting for them, that's the best victory. And I think those are good principles. You know that I'm a military strategist and I'm also a political strategist. It's better to win without fighting than to win with fighting. I think he's got that instinctively, whether he's ever read Clausewitz or Sun Tzu. The problem begins with who you're dealing with and how you deal with them. And here I think we have a cultural clash. We have Western thinking, and I don't want to belittle Trump, or for that matter, Witkoff or Kushner or any of them, but this is not real estate negotiating in New York. This is international strategic conflict negotiating with a leadership and a society that is light years away in culture and value from what they're used to dealing with. And I'll give you just one simple example of this. In America, in the West, when you sign an agreement, that's the end of negotiations. In the Middle East, when you sign an agreement, that's the beginning of the negotiation. And it's hard to reconcile. You say, hey, we shook hands, we signed the documents. Now let's all go out and, have a drink or a cup of coffee or whatever. I was like, no. Now we've just established the basis from which we're going to begin to negotiate. Okay. Now, I don't think it's a question.
As you're sitting there saying that, I think there's a lot of misconceptions by most listeners to this podcast and others, most Westerners. They know the Strait of Hormuz. They've heard a couple of talking points. And the only reason they know the Strait of Hormuz is because they caught it on a news clip or TikTok or something like that. They really have no idea what's actually going on the ground. They really have no clue as to how big Iran is. They really have no clue about the inner workings. They've heard a couple of clips here. They've seen a couple truth posts from Trump, and everybody's an Iran expert. Help us with what are some of the misconceptions that the biggest ones that we're missing with this? What's the plot line we're missing? Okay.
First of all, I think we're missing a cultural value difference. And here I want to be clear. This isn't about being duplicitous. It's about a different understanding of what things mean. The Memorandum of Understanding, or what I call the Memorandum of Misunderstanding, talks about maintaining a status quo. In the West, the status quo is what is when you sign it. In the Middle East, the status quo is whatever it is today. In other words, if I change the status quo yesterday, today the status quo is what I changed it to yesterday. And that's exactly what the Iranians are doing. And I understand them. The status quo was there's going to be no change in their nuclear weapons development program. But if they changed it yesterday, the new status quo is today's status quo. And if the Straits of Hormuz were meant to be frozen in status quo, freedom of navigation and no interruption and no intervention, that was then. But now we've changed the status quo. Now we're shooting at ships. That's the new status quo. And it's a misunderstanding. It's in the sense of the two sides see the words and they mean different things to them. Let me give you a very brief example from the end of the Gulf War in 1991. The Americans and the Iraqis sat down, and one of the things they talked about was a no-fly zone. And in the agreement, it said no aircraft will fly, et cetera, over these zones. And the Americans said, no, we need to specify fixed wing and rotary wing, in other words, regular aircraft and helicopters. And the Iraqis said, no, aircraft is aircraft. And then, like a week later, they were flying helicopters over the no-fly zone, and the Americans said, "But you said no, but look what it says in the document. It says aircraft. Aircraft means fixed wing. You didn't specify rotary wing, so it's okay."
That happened?
Yeah, that's how it happens. And Americans say, "Hey, a verbal agreement is just as valid as a written one." In the Middle East, the written agreement has no value. The verbal agreement is non-existent. And that's what we're seeing. The Iranians are pushing every which way they possibly can against the envelope to create a new status quo every day. Incidentally, Yasser Arafat did this for decades. We would go into negotiations. Israel would make an offer. He would reject it. And the next negotiations, he would say, no, but the offer that they made is now part of the status quo of the negotiations.
Meaning that's the starting point of the next round. Right.
That's right.
But it's our own fault for falling for it as Westerners.
Of course it is.
Because we come from a society where compromise is a virtue. And they come from a society where compromise is a sign of weakness.
It's weakness.
And
it's
therefore,
exactly.
We're actually signaling different things when we advocate for compromise. I want to ask you a question about this current dance that the Americans are doing with the Iranians. And I was doing my own kind of amateurish research, and you could probably tell me more about this. That's why I was looking forward to having you on. That there's this concept in this type of situation called controlled escalation. Right, in military strategy, where
yes,
and correct me if I'm wrong, but what we're seeing here is a perfect example of it, where on both sides, the Iranians and the Americans, there's an interest in keeping things quiet, but there's also an interest in escalating, and they're balancing these interests. Right. Let me explain. For the Americans, they need to degrade the Iranian capability to close the Strait of Hormuz because there's all these Iranian assets, whether they're boats or drone launch sites or missile launch sites and air defenses around the Strait of Hormuz. And the Americans have an interest in degrading all of that, neutering all of it so that the Strait of Hormuz can be open. But they don't want to engage in any kind of escalation that'll turn this again into all-out war, possibly causing a spike in oil prices. On the other hand, they want to do it early enough that they could get that job done and have the straits open in enough time ahead of the midterm elections that it doesn't cause a problem. So they're kind of trying to balance how much escalation. And then on the Iranian side, it's the same thing. The Iranians want the blockade lifted and they want to be able to sell oil. And I heard that just today the blockade was, Trump announced reinstating it. But the Iranians want relief. Yes. They don't want to get bombed. But if everything is too quiet in the Strait of Hormuz, they run the risk of what currently their worst nightmare is Trump does well in the midterms. And they want to scuttle it. So they want enough escalation that things are not going well for Trump, but not too much escalation. So both sides are kind of managing this escalation. And so it's not exactly a stalemate, but it's this very delicate dance that they're doing.
Yes, the international relations term for it is coercive diplomacy, and it's the idea of controlled escalation is an element of it, in the sense that each side wants to create a situation where the threat to the other side threatens them at a higher cost than the perceived value of what they're going to get by violating it.
Okay, slow down, back up, unpack that again. Okay. Explain that.
All right. Simple cost-benefit analysis. If I want you to do something, or, let's put it in what would be called deterrence terms. I don't want you to do something. I want you to not do something. And I tell you, if you do what I don't want you to do, I am going to impose a cost on you. It could be retaliation. It could be sanction. It could be something. But I'm going to impose a cost on you that is higher than the value that you get from what you did that I didn't want you to do. right? Okay, you gained $1 from what you did, and I'm making it cost you $2 for doing it.
Whoa. But in order for that to work, I have to have an accurate understanding of the value my enemy places on each outcome.
Precisely. That's the weakness of the theory. But it's worse than that. Because if I underestimate the value to you and I actually charged you less than you gain, I am creating escalation because you're making a profit on every exchange rather than a loss.
Okay, now read this into our situation.
Okay. The Iranians are doing what they're doing mostly for soft reasons, not for hard strategic reasons. What I mean by that is they're doing it for prestige. They're doing it to maintain their position in the country and around the Middle East. They're doing it to set up a future, as I said, recreating status quo. They're doing it in order to embarrass the American administration. And I'm going to throw two more things into it. One of the consequences of the decapitation strategy of the last round that started at the end of February, which, by the way, I think was a very good strategy. But one of the consequences was that the people who are now in control in Iran are A, more hardline than the ones who were taken out. And I intentionally don't say moderate versus extreme or fanatic. They're all extreme fanatics, but they are more hardline. And two, they have less experience. Okay, like it or not, Ayatollah Khamenei had been around for decades. He knew how to play the game. I don't know what's happening with Khamenei Jr., but the IRGC guys who are running the show now don't have a lot of experience doing what they're doing. The likelihood that combined with their radical Islamist jihadi Khomeiniist ideology will lead them to make a mistake in anticipating American response is significantly higher than with the previous regime. That's issue number one. Issue number two, Western liberal democracies inherently are seen as weak by fascist, totalitarian, dictatorial regimes. This is jihadi, not jihadi, it doesn't make any difference. It's why the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. It's why Hitler declared war on America. I can give you a long list. And the reason for it is very simple. The things that we know that make, and I'll be very specific, America, that make America inherently strong, rights, freedoms, and the like, are looked upon by people like the Iranian regime as weakness. Thousands of people coming out to demonstrate against the government, and everybody goes home safely, and it's true in Israel as well. We see it as the strength of our democracy. They see it as, how the heck can you run a country that way?
How could you let your citizens humiliate you?
That's right. Machine gun them, kill 40,000 of them, and that'll teach them a lesson. How can you not kill tens of thousands of your people when they demonstrate like that? That is weakness. And those two elements, in addition to the things that you said, I think it's a complex picture, but those two additional elements mean that they are going to keep ratcheting it up. And while America is trying to contain the situation, they're trying to push the containment as far as it can go. And I think what we've seen over the past few days, they are very, very quickly getting to the point where it's beyond what Trump and the administration are willing to tolerate. They don't see it because they can't see it.
Wow. So I have a quick question. During this last couple days, the latest round of exchange between the U.S. and Iran has lashed out at just about all of the Gulf states, has shot missiles towards U.S. bases in Jordan and elsewhere, but has been strangely not targeting Israel. Why have they not sent any missiles to Israel?
Not strange at all, because Israel will not play the Trump game. And at least not initially. And here I think we need to be very specific and what they're afraid of, I believe. Okay, Kuwait, Oman, Jordan, whatever, they know that they're not going to do anything to them. Jordan isn't going to do anything in response. So they'll bomb a target. They don't care about that. If I am reading them correctly, that they are reading the situation correctly, they know that if they launch ballistic missiles at Israel now, Israel will respond immediately with a massive counterstrike. Now, when I say massive, I also want to be clear on this. What the Americans have been doing up until now, over the past few days, 80 targets here and 90 targets there and 150 targets, that is all symbolic signaling. In other words, nothing has really been hit that the Iranians care about terribly much. This is slap in the face level response because it's trying to get a message across. Again, this is part of coercive diplomacy. If you do that, I'm going to slap you a couple of times until you get the message. If Israel is struck, Israel, unless I'm completely misreading the strategic understanding of the Israeli leadership, military and civilian, Israel knows two things. One, it will be able to get away with possibly more, but certainly one counterstrike against Iran. In other words, if Iranian missiles hit Israeli targets or are fired at Israeli targets, Trump is not going to tell Israel it can't respond. However, once Israel responds, there's a very high probability, based on our recent experience, that Trump will turn around and say, okay, once was enough, that's it, you can't do it again.
Because Trump doesn't want the all-out war, but
That's
politically
right.
he'll have to allow Israel to do that. And a few weeks ago, we had, now it's close to a month ago now, maybe it's a month ago, we had this one day where Iran attacked Israel, right? And it was right after Israel attacked a Hezbollah headquarters in Beirut. Then Iran retaliated on their behalf with a few missiles at Israel. The whole attack lasted a couple hours. Like there was a few missiles thrown at Israel.
Right.
We had one air raid siren where I live. And Israel retaliated by apparently knocking out some massive petrochemical plant that caused serious damage. The type of infrastructure regime target that America is not hitting right now. So I think that just supports your point that if Iran were to fire missiles at Israel's licking its chops, waiting for Iran to fire something at us to have an excuse to go in there and inflict the type of damage that America is not willing to inflict.
Yes, and under the assumption that it will only get one shot at it, that will be an over rather than under response. In other words, it'll be the antithesis of what the Americans are doing, what you called controlled escalation, and I think the term is valid. In other words, we're going to hit 80 today and 90 tomorrow and 150 the next day, and give them the sense that every day it's going to go up. Israel knows it's not going to have that opportunity. It won't be able to hit 20 targets today with the threat of hitting 50 tomorrow, because after whatever is done today, there's a very, very good chance that Trump will turn around and say, that's it, no more. And what that means is that the Israeli initial response is likely to be massive, overwhelming, and hitting targets that the Americans might hit sometime in the future, but are not trying to go after today because they still want to leave that window of maybe the Iranian leadership will figure it out. Hope springs eternal.
Well, in your estimation, what are those targets that would cause enough pain for Iran to say uncle?
I'm not sure it's about saying uncle, but it would be, first of all, energy resource, infrastructure. It could be, and this was already threatened, transportation infrastructure, existing, the rebuilt or in the process of rebuilding nuclear program as well as ballistic missiles program, and IRGC and Besiege command and control infrastructure, which would also hurt them badly if Israel went after it. So I think those are the categories. The specifics I leave to Israeli Air Force intelligence and the Mossad and those guys who I'm sure have a long list prioritized, just waiting for the order. I would be shocked, seriously shocked, if the Air Force does not already have operational orders for that strike written up with the times written as variables. In other words, H as opposed to the hour, and then just plug it in and go.
Elliot, you mentioned before this concept from Sun Tzu or from Clausewitz that if you could win without kinetic action, that's much preferable. And certainly in this situation where kinetic action causes economic disruptions globally, it causes domestic problems for Trump.
For sure.
So in this situation where we don't even know if this or that airstrike is more dangerous to the regime than a more hermetic blockade, or the very fact that even if it's not hermetic, the catastrophic collapse of the Iranian economy can only go on so long. So is it possible that, even though in our camp there's people tend to are looking forward to when things go kinetic again and see the ceasefire as a problem, but as long as Iran is collapsing from within and that's progressing and we can keep the economic stranglehold going, isn't it preferable to just be patient and keep that going rather than to do anything kinetic?
If you could project into the future in a linear fashion, yes. The problem is the enemy has a vote. And they have a whole bunch of ways to get around it, including China, Russia. All the indicators of imminent collapse could be 20 years off. We don't know. And that's where the problem is. Or it could be tomorrow. I mean, remember the fall of the Soviet Union. We woke up one morning and it was gone. Or the Syrian regime, for that matter.
Yeah, it happened suddenly.
The problem with that, right? But the problem with that as a strategy is that the reverse is also true. Look how long Saddam Hussein held out under sanctions and having been beaten up and all of that. So the short answer is yes, and the long answer is yes, but no. It would be preferable if it works, but there's no guarantee. And if it fails, you're in a really bad position.
Now, I know, Elliot, you don't like to play prophet, but what are the things you are looking at? What are you keeping your eye on and saying, if that happens, then I'm going to look for this? What are the couple of key indicators you're watching to say this is going to go in this direction or that direction?
First of all, Iranian missteps, the reports were, and I only saw it, I didn't see them confirmed, maybe you guys have, that they fired at American warships today. Now, firing at American warships can be symbolic. In other words, you send a couple of drones knowing they're going to get shot down. On the other hand, when they put a missile into an aircraft carrier, even by accident,
that's going to be a problem.
They've changed the rules. On this end, I've always referred to this vis-a-vis Hezbollah over the years, something that I call the nursery school scenario. They're firing rockets and they're landing here and they're landing there, but the first one that hits a nursery school and kills 15 kids, that whole tit for tat system simply falls apart. So an error of calculation, with, depending on whose side you're on, the good luck or bad luck of it actually working, is one of the things that I'm looking at. And how many times they do it, of course, increases the odds that it could happen. Okay. And I just want to be clear, hitting an American aircraft carrier is not simple, but mistakes happen. Some guy looks up instead of looking down and hits the wrong button, and the missile gets through. And again, I am neither predicting it and certainly not hoping for it, but it's an example. Sinking a whole bunch of ships in the Straits. It's one thing to hit one or two every now and then. If they launch a massive attack and sink, pick your number, 15 tankers in one day. And they didn't mean to. They attacked 15 hoping to get two. Completely changes the situation. If they decide, and I can see an out-of-control escalation that goes something like this. They tell Hezbollah to start firing at Israel. Israel responds heavily against Hezbollah. Iran says, if you keep responding, we're coming in. Hezbollah fires more rockets. Israel, of course, responds. Iran fires missiles into Tel Aviv and Haifa. We're in a different place than we are where we're sitting at the moment. And these are all, I think, reasonable scenarios as they go. On the flip side, if the Iranian people wake up tomorrow morning and say enough is enough and rise up en masse against the regime, we can see something going in an entirely different direction. Now, let's throw in Hamas, the Houthis. There was an incident today in Sana'a. The Saudis apparently bombed the airport. There's a lot of stuff happening in what we would call the periphery, but that can have an immediate effect on the center as well.
Well, Elliot, I thought Hamas was disbanding and the Board of Peace was taking over, and it was all going really well down there in Gaza.
Yeah, Witkoff said they promised him that they were going to disarm. And, a Hamas promise is almost as good as a Hamas guarantee. The UN, God help us, issued a report today saying that Hamas is rebuilding, they're stealing aid, they're preventing it from getting to the population. The UN. The Messiah has got to be around the corner.
That's unbelievable. I mean, the UN woke up, 2.5 years late to this reality?
Yeah, right.
Quite something.
Exactly.
Ellie, with the last few minutes we have, maybe we could talk about Lebanon, because, again, it's been so long since we spoke to you. And the strategic calculus in Lebanon has gotten really, really interesting with, the Americans and the MOU basically conceding that Iran has a say in Lebanese security decisions, in the Lebanese security situation. But then the deal that Marco Rubio's office brokered between the Israelis and the Lebanese government directly, which was entirely about Iran having zero say in Lebanon's security situation. Correct. And it's really not, it's about whether or not Lebanon is a sovereign country. But there are still a lot of different forces pulling in different directions. Erdogan is trying to have a say here as well. What's your assessment of this delicate situation in Lebanon?
First of all, predicting Lebanon is a fool's mission. I'm not going to step into that. I believe that President Aoun of Lebanon, who's Christian, would like very much to disarm and oust Hezbollah. And that, with American carrot and stick, aid, threat, negotiating, brings them to where they are. And he certainly doesn't want Iran in there. By the way, anybody who knows the history of Lebanon, part of where we are today in Lebanon has to do with Syrian intervention and involvement in the country in the 70s and 80s. And Iran would be worse, not better. And Syria was a disaster. So he certainly would like to, keep Iran out, and Syria for that matter, and Turkey for that matter, and try to maintain some sort of independence. He's caught on the horns of a dilemma because Hezbollah has stated outright that it will bring down the country rather than give up its position, because Hezbollah doesn't really care about sovereign Lebanon. It's an open question even today, after the beating that Hezbollah took from us over the past couple of years, whether Hezbollah is stronger than the Lebanese army or not. And there are two reasons for that. One, the Lebanese army is nothing to get excited over. And two, it's made up, a large proportion of its troops are Shiites. And there's an open question whether they will actually obey orders to go after Hezbollah if the order is given. So President Aoun, who's a former chief of staff of the army, by the way, is caught in the horns of that dilemma as well. We've agreed to hand over a couple of areas on a pilot program to the Lebanese army. That has not come to pass yet. The Lebanese army hasn't gotten its act together. The Americans have promised an advisory role. They're going to give some money to that, not a huge amount. The only way I see it working, and I don't think Aoun is going to go for it, because he's got his own internal domestic issues, is if he agrees to allow the IDF to support his troops against Hezbollah. Not with ground support, in other words, not fighting shoulder to shoulder, and pitch in for the podcast.
It's a good name for a podcast.
It is. But artillery support, air support, interdiction, which, by the way, the Egyptians for many years did with the Israeli Air Force against Al-Qaeda and ISIS forces in Sinai. With all of the issues with Egypt, when they needed it, they called in Israeli airstrikes against Al-Qaeda in Sinai. And It was one of these, big open secrets. So if they go that way, they've got a chance. No guarantees, but they've got a chance. If he tries to dance, between all of the raindrops simultaneously, I believe he'll fail. Lebanon will once again go from a weak state to a failed state, possibly to a collapsed state. And then, it's anybody's guess who goes into the vacuum.
Wow. Well, this has been really, really helpful. And if you enjoyed Elliot's analysis, I have to plug this. Go to Conflict Uncovered. You can get it anywhere you listen to podcasts. Be sure you'll get deep military analysis. You'll be able to hear a lot more from Elliot over on Conflict Uncovered. Elliot, we always appreciate your insight and appreciate you joining us here on Shoulder to Shoulder.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, rate, and share this podcast. Subscribe on Patreon. Come on over to Facebook, like our page, join our group. So we would love to connect with more and more of our Shoulder to Shoulder family. We'll see you on our next episode.